Namaskaram. Today I'm going to be talking about how Bhagavan clarified the practice of Advaita. And he did, and in doing so, he also presented Advaita in a very fresh, clear, refined, and simple manner. The basic teaching of Advaita is that what exists is ekam eva advaitiyam, one only without a second. And what is that one that actually exists? Tattvamasi, you are that. These two are the basic principles of Advaita. There are huge volumes have been written on Advaita. It has become an extremely complex philosophy for a number of reasons. That is, the primary objection to Advaita, because Advaita says there's one only without a second, that is quite contrary to our experience. We experience all this multiplicity. So if there's one only without a second, how to explain this appearance of multiplicity? Advaita has a simple answer, but all this is just an illusory appearance. But there are various ways of explaining how it can be an illusory appearance. The simplest way of explaining it is that all this is just like a dream. In a dream, everything we see, it is just an illusory appearance. None of it actually exists. We see a world with so many objects and so many people, but none of these exist. They exist only in the view of the dreamer. So this is the simplest way of explaining the appearance of multiplicity. But to say that all this is a dream is, for most people, this idea is, most people won't relish this idea, but this is all a dream, but none of this exists except in our view. So Advaita has to cater for people of different levels of spiritual maturity. So it has other alternative ways of explaining this. That is, the vast majority of Advaita texts explain this, but all this is a creation. That is, Brahman in association with Maya is Ishwara, and by Ishwara, by the power of Maya, has created all this. And there's an elaborate explanation about how all these things were created, one thing from another. Bhagavan explained, as Bhagavan often explained, these different very different levels of explanation within Advaita, suited to people of different levels of spiritual maturity. And an example of how he explained this is recorded in Day by Day on the 15th of March, 1946, in the afternoon. One devotee is reading to Bhagavan a letter that he received from his friend. And in that letter, his friend had written, Ramana Maharshi is an exponent of the Ajata doctrine of Advaita Vedanta. Of course, it's a bit difficult. And then Devaraja Mudliya records that Bhagavan remarked on this. Somebody has told him so. I do not teach only the Ajata doctrine. I approve all schools. The same truth has to be expressed in different ways to suit the capacity of the hearer. The Ajata doctrine says, nothing exists except the one reality. There is no birth or death, no projection or drawing in, no sadhaka, no mumukshu, no mukta, no bondage, no liberation. The one unity alone ever exists. To such as find it difficult to grasp this truth and who ask, how can we ignore this solid world we see all around us? The dream experience is pointed out, and they are told, all that you see depends on the seer. Apart from the seer, there is no seen. This is called Drishti Shrishti Vada. or the argument that one first creates out of his mind and then sees what his mind itself has created. To such as cannot grasp even this, and who further argue, the dream experience is so short while the world always exists. The dream experience is limited to me, but the world is felt and seen not only by me, but by so many, and we cannot call such a world non-existent. The argument called Srishti Drishti Vada is addressed, and they are told, God first created such and such a thing out of such and such an element, and then something else, and so forth. That alone will satisfy this class. Their mind is otherwise not satisfied and may ask themselves, how can all geography, all maps, all sciences, stars, planets, and rules governing or relating to them, and all knowledge be totally untrue? To such it is best to say, yes, God created all this, and so you see it. And then the devotee who was reading this letter to Bhagavan said, but all these cannot be true. Only one doctrine can be true. And in reply to which Bhagavan said, all of these are only to suit the capacity of the learner. The absolute can only be one. So Bhagavan, in this case, and in many other cases, Bhagavan explained that there are different levels of explanation within Advaita to suit people of different levels of spiritual maturity. So when we study any Advaitic text, it's important to understand this fact that there are different levels of explanation, and we need to, we shouldn't confuse different levels of explanation. On other occasions, Bhagavan explained about these three levels in more detail. That is, Bhagavan said, Ajata is the ultimate truth, but it is not a teaching, because Ajata denies the existence of anything apart from the one reality. So there's no teacher, no guru, no disciple, there's no sadhaka, no sadhana, no bondage, no liberation. In other words, Ajata doesn't explain this appearance of multiplicity. It simply denies that there is any such appearance at all. So Ajata also doesn't provide a means to solve our problem, because it simply denies that the problem exists. So this is the ultimate truth. But how do we get to this ultimate truth? We need a means to get there, because now we experience this multiplicity. So Bhagavan said the most suitable teaching for serious spiritual aspirants is Drishti Srishti Vada. This is the simplest. Drishti Srishti. Drishti means perception. Srishti means creation. So Drishti Srishti Vada says there is no creation other than perception. And the classic example is a dream. In a dream, we see a whole world. But that world doesn't exist apart from our perception of it. So everything that appears in a dream depends upon the one who sees it. In other words, the dreamer. The dreamer creates the dream world by seeing it. This is Drishti Srishti Vada. This is what Bhagavan taught us. In all of Bhagavan's original writings, we will find he's constantly stressing this Drishti Srishti Vada. Not necessarily by name, but I mean this idea that everything that is seen depends upon the seer. This is very, very clear in Nana, Uludu Napadu, Arunachashtakam, and in other places. And even in his answer to the question, Bhagavan was constantly stressing this. Why did Bhagavan stress this? Firstly, it is closer to the truth, but that the ultimate truth is nothing. But the logical implication of Drishti Srishti Vada is Ajata Vada, as explained by Bhagavan. That is, everything that is seen depends upon the seer. Who the seer is ego. It's only when we rise as ego that we perceive this world. So the whole world depends for its seeming existence upon ego. And if we investigate ego, ego is nothing but a false awareness of ourselves. That is, what we actually are is just that is just pure awareness. That is the fundamental awareness of our own existence, I am. That alone is what is real. That is ekameva advaityam, one only without a second. That is what we actually are. But when we rise as ego, ego always projects and takes a body as itself. So as ego, we are always aware of ourselves as I am this body. This body is obviously not what we actually are. So ego is a false awareness of ourselves. It's a mistaken awareness of ourselves. So if we investigate it, in other words, if we investigate ourselves to see what we actually are, when we see what we actually are, we will see we are just that pure awareness I am, which is immutable. It never undergoes any change. So we have never actually risen as ego. So the ultimate truth is there's no such thing as ego. Since there's no ego, therefore, in the absence of ego, nothing else can exist. So since there has never been any ego, there has never been any world. So the ultimate truth is ajata. So this is the practical means that is Drishti Shrishtivada provides us with the practical means to attain the experience of ajata, which is the ultimate truth. This is why Bhagavan always stressed this Drishti Shrishtivada. But of course, Bhagavan, as he said, the teaching has to be according to the taught. So often you will find Bhagavan speaks, comes down to lower levels of explanation to suit people who are not ready to grasp this. As he said, there are some people who will never be satisfied with this. If you tell them the world is just a dream, they cannot reconcile their mind to it. Just as Bhagavan sometimes, for example, an example of the sort of circumstance under which Bhagavan will come down from this level. If someone wants to, if people came to Bhagavan and said, oh, there's so many problems in the world, there's so much injustice and unrighteousness and everything, I want to work for the good of the world. Bhagavan often used to say, he who has created the world knows how to take care of it. Leave it all to him. Your job is just to surrender yourself to him. So there Bhagavan is talking from a Drishti perspective, that is, that God has created this world. Why? Because those people have very strongly outward going mind, so they won't be ready to accept that this is all just a dream. So Bhagavan addresses his teachings to them at an appropriate level. In the same way, Adi Shankara, in the vast majority of his commentaries on the Prastanatraya Bhashya, the explanations he is giving are in accordance with Shrishti Drishtivada. The reason for this is Adi Shankara had a divine mission to establish Advaita as the correct interpretation of Vedanta, of the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita. So he had to present it in a way, in order to win over people who believed in other interpretations. He had to modify, he had to dilute it to suit them. So Shankara, generally, in most of his commentaries, he's talking more from the perspective of Shrishti Drishtivada. And if you study other Advaita texts, the vast majority are talking from the perspective of Shrishti Drishtivada. It is often said that Drishti Shrishtivada, that is what Bhagavan teaches, that the world depends upon our perception of it. It is often, this view is often attributed to a person called Prakasananda, who lived in the 16th century. He coined this term Shrishti Drishtivada, but actually what he said was not anything new. For example, Gaudapada, in his Mandukya Karika, though he doesn't use the term Shrishti Drishtivada, he very, very clearly argues the position of Shrishti Drishtivada, particularly in the second and third chapters. In the second chapter, the main theme running throughout the chapter is that waking is no different to dream. So if we say waking is no different to dream, that is Srishti Drishti Bhada. Just that label isn't given to it, but what he's arguing there is Drishti Srishti Bhada. Often it is said, but Gaudapada teaches Ajatavada. It is true, he does mention Ajatavada here and there, particularly in the second chapter, in verse 32, there's the famous sloka, Na nirodo na chopati. There's no destruction. Why is there no destruction? Because there's no utpati. There's no arising. Nothing ever comes into being. So there's no, and therefore there's no sadhaka, no mumukshu, no bondage, no liberation. This is the ultimate truth. So it's generally, people take Gaudapada to be an Ajatavadi, but he mentions there Ajatavada as the conclusion of Drishti Srishti Vada, which, as I say, he doesn't use the term Drishti Srishti Vada, but all that he's arguing there is Drishti Srishti Vada, but the world is just a dream. So, and Shankara, those in commentaries on other Upanishads and things, Shankara seems to take the standpoint of Srishti Drishti Vada. Naturally, when he's commenting on Gaudapada, he very clearly takes the view of Drishti Srishti Vada also, but this world is just a dream. So these different levels are there to suit different people. Why it is important to understand this is, if we are studying Advaita, or if we listen to people who give lectures on Advaita, we have to understand that the majority of the explanations are not applicable to Bhagavan's teachings, because Bhagavan has given us a much simpler explanation. For example, according to Srishti Drishti Bhada, there is a difference between waking and dream. That is, the waking state, because this world was created by God, this waking state has a greater degree of reality than the dream state. The dream state is what is called pratibhasika satya, seeming reality, whereas the waking state is vivaharika satya, it's transactional reality. And it is it teaches that the world exists independent of our perception of it. That is what Srishti Drishti Vada is teaching. So Bhagavan doesn't accept that distinction. Bhagavan said the waking state is nothing but a dream. Just like a dream is a creation of the mind, but everything that we perceive in the waking state is just a creation of our own mind. So, as I say, the main aim of Bhagavan's teaching, Bhagavan's teachings are all concerned with practice. So it is for practical reasons that Bhagavan taught Srishti Drishti Bhada. Not only is it closest to the truth, it is also the most practical means. People who study the ancient texts, that is the more traditional texts, where this Srishti Drishti Bhada dominates, they will give long, they can give detailed explanations how the world comes into existence and everything, but all these are not useful for a serious aspirant. And the other problem in the older texts, what is the actual practice? How are we to attain that is not clearly expressed. It is said, but only by Atma Vichara can you attain that, or Brahma Vichara. But what is Atma Vichara? They take Atma Vichara to be, they say very different ways of doing Atma Vichara. There's the Panchakosa Prakriya, that is considering all the five sheaves and why those five sheaves are not I. That's one way of doing Atma Vichara. Another way is the Avastatreya Prakriya, that is discriminating about the three states. Another way is Drisya Prakriya, that is distinguishing the seer from the seen. These are all preliminary. Bhagavan wasn't against all these. These are all necessary. We need to understand, obviously, before we can investigate what we actually are, we first need to understand what we are not. If we take ourselves to be the body, or the prana, or the mind, or the intellect, or the will, any of these five sheaves, if we're asked to investigate ourselves, we'll be investigating these things. But these are all drishya, things perceived by us, they're objects, whereas we are the subject. So if we're to investigate ourselves, we need to turn away from objects back towards the subject. So what Bhagavan means by Atma Vichara, he makes very clear. Atma Vichara is not, that is all this understanding what we are not. This is the preliminary analysis. The neti is a preliminary analysis that is necessary as for us to point us in the right direction. What are we to investigate? But it is not itself the practice. So what the actual practice is not clearly explained in a vast majority of texts. So they think that by studying the text, you can, they say, ignorance is the problem. So you need knowledge to get rid of ignorance. Therefore, if you study all these Advaitic texts, all the, that is very introductory texts, and then there are the Mula text, the original text, the Upanishads and the Brahma Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita, there are the commentaries on them, and there are so many supplementary texts. If you go on and if you go studying these and get a stronger and stronger conviction, eventually you'll be firmly rooted in the belief, in the conviction that you are Brahman, that you are not any of these things. But really, that's merely an intellectual conviction. That cannot remove what is the ignorance. Bhagavan said, to whom is ignorance? Ignorance is only to, Brahman is not ignorant of itself. It is only when we rise as ego, it is as ego that we are ignorant of ourselves. So what is called self-ignorance is nothing but ego. So ego is the root problem. So who is it who is studying all the texts? It is only ego. So Bhagavan clarified that this is not the practice of the correct practice of Advaita. He clarified this very clearly in the 16th and 17th paragraphs of Nana. What he says in the 16th paragraph, in the first sentence, he says, "Ennulilum mukti adevadaku manate adaka vendum endru solla patu ulla padiyal." That means, since in every text, here every text implies every text of Advaita, it is said that for attaining mukti, liberation, it is necessary to make the mind cease. So that is what is said in every text. That is the conclusion of every text, but the mind has to cease. So then he goes on to say, Mano nigraha me nulgalin mudivana karatu endru arindu konda pimbu. After knowing that mano nigraha generally means restraint or subjugation of the mind. In this context, it means destruction of the mind. Alone is the ultimate intention or aim or purpose of all such texts. Nulgale alavindri padipatal payanilde. There is no benefit to be gained by studying texts without limit. So Bhagavan is pointing out we shouldn't go down this route of studying endless texts. You could fill libraries with all the texts that have been written on Advaita philosophy, but as Shankara himself warns in, Shankara refers to this in Vivekachudamani, and he uses a term, Sastra Jala Maharanya, the great forest of sastras. So we shouldn't get lost in that forest of sastras. So Bhagavan is warning us. What we need to do is to understand the essence of Advaita. And once we understand the essence of Advaita, then we need to apply it in practice. So Bhagavan goes on to say in the second sentence, Manate adavadaku tanne ya endru vicharaka vendume. For making the mind cease, it is necessary to investigate oneself as who. As who here implies to see who we actually are. We need to investigate in order to see what we actually are, or in order to be aware of what we actually are. that's the first clause of the sentence. Then he goes on to say, Alamal epiti nulgalil vicharipadu. This is a very terse way of saying it, but alamal here, alamal means instead. It implies, but instead of doing so, epidi nulgalil vicharipadu. That means how investigating text. That means how can we know ourselves by investigating text. So it's not in the books that we can find self-knowledge, it's only within ourselves. Then he goes on to say, Tanne, Tanudaya Jnana Kannal Tane Arya Vendam. It is necessary to know oneself only by one's own eye of jnana. Jnana here means awareness. That is it. We can know ourselves only by our own eye of awareness. It's not from things outside that we can know ourselves, it's only from within, is the implication. And then he gives a simple analogy. Raman, Tanne, Raman Endru Arya, Kanadi Vendama. Does Raman, he just takes his name Raman, he's just an example of a person's name. So there's a person called Raman. Does Raman need a mirror to know himself as Raman? That if the books are outside, we don't need books to know what we actually are. We need to look within to see what we actually are. And then he goes on to say, Tan Panchakosam Galul Irupadu. Oneself is within the Panchakosas. The Panchakosa means the 5 sheaths. That's the physical body, mind, intellect, and will. These are the things that we now mistake ourselves to be. And hence they cover and obscure what we actually are. So what we actually are is not outside these 5 sheaths, it's within the 5 sheaths. Nulgalo avatraku velil irupave. Whereas texts are outside them, that means outside the 5 sheaths. Ahaya panchakosangale niki vicharaka vendia tanne nulgalil vicharipedu vine. Therefore, investigating in text in order to know oneself, whom it is necessary to investigate, setting aside or removing all the 5 sheaths is useless. That is, in order to know ourselves, we need to turn within and thereby set aside the Panchakosas. How do we set aside the Panchakosas? By turning our attention away from them back towards ourselves. So trying to know ourselves in books, by studying books, it is useless. He said, Vicharapatu vine, a there intensifies it. It's certainly useless. And then he goes on to give a very simple definition, a very simple and beautiful definition of what is mukti. Banditil irakum tan ya endru vicharipadu tan yatata sorupate terindu kolvade mukti. That means banditil irakum tan ya endru vicharipadu. Investigating oneself who is in bondage, then implied by investigating oneself who is in bondage, yatata sarupate terindu kolvade mukti, knowing one's yatata sarupa, one's actual own nature, alone is mukti. So we can attain mukti only by investigating. Now we seem to be in bondage. So who am I who seem to be in bondage? Only by investigating this I who seems to be in bondage, and thereby knowing our real nature, that alone is mukti. And then in the next sentence, he gives a very, very clear and unambiguous description of what is Atmavichara. That is, as I said, the idea of many people is that by studying all these texts, and that is Atmavichara, but Bhagavan gives a very clear and logical explanation of what is Atmavichara. He says, Sada kalamam manate atmavil vetirvada kutan atmavicharam endrupaya. That means the name Atmavichara refers only to, he doesn't say practice, but it implies the practice of always keeping the mind in oneself, or on oneself. Atma means oneself here. So in the way to express it in Tamil, if you attend to something, you say, in Tamil we say keeping the mind in that thing. In English we say on. So the implication here is, but always keeping our mind fixed on ourself, that alone is Atmavichara. In other words, being self-attentive alone is Atmavichara. Attending to other books, thinking about all these things, that is not Atmavichara. It may be useful to us. We need to understand clearly. We need to understand the basic principle, but that we then have to put that understanding into practice by turning our attention away from everything else back towards ourselves. But in those who study these texts, they think you have to continue meditating on these texts. And what do these texts teach you? They say you are Brahman. So in the next sentence, Bhagavan says, Dhyanamo, he's contrasting. First, he's defined what is Atmavichara. I mean, he's contrasting it. Dhyanamo, the O there implies whereas. Whereas dhyana, meditation, is Dhyanamo, Tanne Satchidananda Brahmam Aha Bhavipadu. Whereas dhyana is imagining oneself to be Satchidananda Brahman. That is, Brahman means what actually exists, which is Satchidananda. So if we are reading those books and the books explain, but we are not this body and so on. We are just Brahman, whose nature is Satchidananda. But until we investigate ourselves, we don't actually see that. So if we continue studying those books and meditating on what is taught in the books, it's just an imagination. So long as we experience ourselves as a body, to think I am Brahman is just an imagination. It's not our actual experience. If we want it to be our experience, we need to investigate ourselves by turning our attention inwards. And then Bhagavan concludes this paragraph by saying, because he's criticizing endless study of texts, he says, Katrave aneteyum orukalatil maraka vendivarum. That is, a time will come when it will be necessary to forget all that one has learned. That is however much we learn, we forget every day when we go to sleep, we forget all that we've learned. And when death comes, we're going to forget it all. So, and when in order to attain mukti, we need the annihilation of ego. When ego is annihilated, who remains to remember all that has been learned? So Bhagavan is discouraging, that is, he's not, we need to understand the basic principles as taught by him clearly in his own original writings, but we don't need to go on and on and on endlessly studying texts, because that's sending our mind in the wrong direction. That is, once we understand that we are that, what should we do? We should investigate, then who am I? And then the next paragraph, Bhagavan indirectly criticizes or warns us against the Shrishti Drishti Vada. That is the view that this world is created by God from, as he says in that passage that I read from Day by Day, God first created such and such a thing out of such and such an element, and then something else, and so forth. That is how it's described in a lot of Advaita texts. But how from Maya, there are 3 gunas, and there are so many 5 tanmatras, and there are all these different, so many tattvas are enumerated and analyzed and everything. Bhagavan talks about this in the next paragraph. What he says in the next paragraph, he gives actually in the original version, in the original question and answer version, Bhagavan had referred to the hair in a barber's shop. But here he slightly simplified it. He doesn't explicitly refer to the hair in a barber's shop. What he says here is, Kupeye kuti tala vendia oruvan ade arrivedal epidi paya nilayo. That means just as one who needs to gather or sweep up and throw away rubbish would derive no benefit by investigating it, as I say, in the earlier question and answer version, he said, he slightly expanded this. He said, all the hair in a barber shop needs to be swept up and thrown away. But rather than, instead of sweeping it up and throwing it away, analyzing how many short hairs and how many long hairs, how many gray hairs, how many black hairs, how many red hairs, how many blonde hairs, analyzing it, what has to be thrown away is useless. So just like it's useless to examine all the rubbish that is to be thrown away, so so he goes on to say, apadiye, in such a way, in likewise, tanne aria vendia oravam, one who is to know oneself, tanne marundu kondiru cum tatvangal aneteum, setu talla vendi vidamal, ave itene endru kanakiru vidalum, avatring gunangal arrivadalum payanile. In the same way, just like it's useless to examine the rubbish that is to be thrown away, so one who needs to know oneself will derive no benefit by, instead of collectively rejecting all the tattvas which are concealing oneself, calculating that they are this many and examining their qualities. So in this one sentence, Bhagavan brushes aside all the Shrishti Drishti Vada explanations. Why he does this? He does this for serious aspirants. If we really want to know ourselves, we don't need to analyze how all these things were created by Maya and all these. It's unnecessary. Because his conclusion to this paragraph is in the second and last sentence, prapanjate oru swapnate pol eni kolla vendam. It is necessary to consider the world like a dream. That is, if this whole world is a dream, we don't have to analyze the dream. Who is the dreamer is what we need to investigate. So Bhagavan's teachings are all turning our attention. That is, whatever Bhagavan taught us, it has practical implications. Because it's all very nice to study Advaita philosophy, but it doesn't solve our problem. All problems arise when we arise as ego. So the root of all problems is our rising as ego. And what is the nature of ego? That is what Bhagavan teaches us. This he teaches us in so many ways, but he teaches it so clearly in Uludunapadu. For example, in verse 25 of Uludunapadu, Bhagavan very clearly gives what is the nature of ego. And remember, everything that is seen, it appears only in the view of ego. So ego is the root of all appearances. So what is the nature of this ego? Bhagavan describes it as a formless phantom. It's formless because it's got no form of its own. It's a phantom because it's got no substance of its own. It borrowed, that is, the substance of ego is the fundamental awareness I am, but that doesn't belong to ego. It's borrowed that from Satchit, from our real nature. So it's got no substance of its own. It's also got no form of its own. So it has to hold on to a body and take a body to be itself in order to have a form. So it borrows its substance from Satchit and its form from a body. So after describing it, well, it's in the last line that he describes it as a formless phantom. From the beginning, how he starts is Urupatri undam, grasping form, it comes into its existence. Urupatri nikum, grasping form, it stands. Urupatri undu mika ongum, grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. Uruvittu urupatram, leaving form, it grasps form. That means leaving one form, it grasps another form. So grasping of form is the very nature of ego. From the moment it rises to the moment it subsides, ego is always grasping form. What's he mean by grasping form? Well, since ego is a formless phantom, all forms are something other than ego. The first form that ego grasps, it grasps the form of a body. Body here means, as he says in the 5th verse, Uru Panchakosa Uru, the body is a form of 5 sheaths. So this bundle of 5 sheaths. This is the form that we grasp. This is what Bhagavan means by the term body. This is the first form that we grasp. As we first project a body consisting of 5 sheaths, and take that body as ourself. And then through the 5 senses of that body, we project an external world. And within the mind of that, the mind, there seems to be an internal world also. So that grasping of form, that means holding on to things other than itself, attending to things other than itself. This is the nature of ego. So how to get rid of this ego? Since ego cannot stand without grasping form, the trick Bhagavan has given us, try to grasp yourself. That is, if ego, instead of trying to grasp things other than itself, tries to grasp itself, what will happen? That he says in the next sentence, Tedinal otum pidicum. That means if sought, it will take flight. So the nature of ego is to rise, stand, and flourish by attending to things other than itself, but to take flight, to subside and dissolve back into its source by investigating itself, by trying to hold on to itself. So this is the vital clue that Bhagavan has given us. And this is why we can never attain self-knowledge by investigating in scriptures, as Bhagavan said in that 16th paragraph, because they are other than ourselves, they're outside ourselves. So we need to investigate ourselves. We need to turn our attention back within, and then only we can separate ourselves from all forms and know ourselves as we actually are. And in so many verses in Ulladu, that is a recurring theme throughout Ulladu, is that the root of everything is ego. If we investigate ego, everything else will disappear. For example, in the 9th verse of Ulladu, he says, dyads and triads always exist holding one thing. Dyads here means pairs of opposites. Triads means the 3 factors of objective knowledge. That is, when we know something, every knowledge, every experience, every perception takes the basic form. I know this, I experience this, I perceive this. That is, I is the knower. This is whatever is known, the phenomenon or object that is known. So I is the subject, what is known is the object. And what is the relationship between the subject and the object is the knowing. That is how the link between the knower and the known is the knowing. Without knowing, there cannot be anything known. So all things that are known depend upon the knower. So depend upon the knowing. And without a knower, there cannot be any knowing. So knowing depends upon the knower. So ultimately, the whole triad, it all resolves back to the knower. That is what Bhagavan means by the one thing. That is the one thing that the dyads and triads exist holding is ego, the knower. So some people misinterpret it, but Bhagavan here is talking about the real, our real nature. They say the self with a capital S. That is not what Bhagavan means here. He's referring to ego. He explained this very clearly to Lakshman Sharma. So in a triad, the things known depend upon the knowing, and the knowing depends upon the knower. So the knower is the base of all. The knower means ego, is the base for the appearance of all this multiplicity. And dyads means pairs of opposites. Pairs of opposites are things known by us, so they depend upon the knower. And then he says, this is the important point, if one sees within the mind what that one thing is, in other words, if we investigate this ego within ourselves, they will cease to exist. Why will they cease to exist? Because they depend for their seeming existence on ego. And if we investigate ego, it will cease to exist. So like this, there are so many verses in Ulladu where Bhagavan is repeatedly stressing this. For example, in verse 14, he talks about, so long as there's the first person, second and third persons will exist. But if one investigates the truth of the first person, the second, the first person will cease to exist, and hence the second and third persons will also cease to exist. Here, first person means ego, and second and third persons means everything else. So if we rise as ego, second and third persons will exist. But if we investigate the truth, if one's self-investigating the reality of the first person ceases to exist, second and third persons will come to an end, and the nature that then shines as one, that is what we actually are. So and that is the Ekameva Advaita. Okay, I seem to have come to the end of the time I had. There were some more things I wanted to explain, but we can go on explaining this. But the main point I wanted to make today is how Bhagavan's made. Not only has he simplified and clarified the philosophy of Advaita, expressed it in a very refined and simple way, in doing so, he has made it very clear what is the practice. That is, studying texts is useful only to the extent that it encourages us to turn back within to investigate ourselves. For that, the only text we need are Bhagavan's own original writings. These works are all the help, all the guidance that we need, Bhagavan has provided in these texts in a very simple, clear, and practical manner. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Arunachala Ramanaya.